Okay, I think we're going to get started, everybody. Welcome, welcome. That's a great turnout in this gorgeous new building, so thank you all for coming. I want to thank Matt, who's our leader here in the front row. For anybody who doesn't know him, he's a wonderful asset to Fells. Also, Urea, who does all the work, and I get all the credit, which is really a wonderful deal. And Cameron, back in the back. So thank you all for all you've done to put us here. So as you know, this is one in our series of public policy and practice, and we have amazingly inspiring people with us today. No pressure. You have to be inspiring now, Ayo. But we also have, so we have two people here today. I know you don't see the other person, but she's what we used to call in the White House the voice of God, VOG. So Dale, say hello on the phone.
Hello.
So Ayo is here, and I will introduce her first, and then I will introduce Dale. But let me just say, Dale had a pretty serious dog accident, actually, this week. Her dog went after another dog, and she crushed her hand and her wrist. So fortunately, she's been at the hospital for special surgery, but unable to travel. So we are immensely grateful that she is with us this way. So thank you, Dale.
Glad to be here.
Yes, it's a great pleasure that you were able to do this. So let me introduce Ayodele Gansallo, who's here with us and is local in Philadelphia, works with HIAS PA, which stands for Hebrew Immigrant
Aid Society.
Aid Society, HIAS. Was founded in 1880 or so, and originally worked for Jewish immigrants fleeing the pogroms in Russia and Eastern Europe. Now it is working for all immigrants, providing them with legal services and representation, and I was a very senior counsel there. But also you're from England and Wales originally, actually Nigeria before that until you were 4, but then England and Wales where you were a barrister.
Solicitor.
A solicitor, yes. And for 25 years, Ayo has worked on immigration issues for nonprofit organizations there and here. You don't look about more than 25, but anyway, I must be
26.
Okay, I got that. Yeah, I guess it agrees with you. It should be very stressful. Anyway, and focuses on complex litigation before the U.S. Immigration Court, the Board of Immigration Appeals, the Federal District Court, and the U.S. Court of Appeals for the Third Circuit, where actually you have a big case coming up on November the 7th, which we'll talk a little bit about. Also, an adjunct professor at Penn's Law School, so a local. And Ayo, you've won more awards than I really can even mention, but the Mayor's Commission, you're on the Mayor's Commission for African and Caribbean Immigrant Affairs, recipient of the Philadelphia Chapter Mentorship Award, the Pro Bono Champion Award, Unsung Heroine Award for last year, the Philadelphia Bar Foundation Award also for last year. So great pleasure to have you, and a wonderful background. And then Dale, who we have on the phone. Dale Russakoff spent 28 years writing for the Washington Post on many issues, politics, education, social policy. Also, and then left the Post, became a freelance writer and an author, and wrote the New York Times acclaimed book called The Prize, which you may have read. It's about the $100 million that Mark Zuckerberg gave to the Newark school system. And Dale's book, actually, I just learned from her, although she told me humbly, changed the Zuckerbergs' philanthropy dramatically, because they got it wrong. And Dale, you can talk about that later. But instead of giving for sort of a time frame of 5 years, they're now investing, or they're now supporting, efforts for 25 to 50 years. And the other thing you just told me is that the Zuckerbergs learned from your book that you can't empower a population without engaging them. So those were the two takeaways that the Zuckerbergs really took away. So that was Dale's book. You may know The Prize. Now, Dale has been writing actually front page pieces for the Philadelphia Inquirer. These were co-authored with a colleague, and several articles for Pro Publica published on the front page, as I said, of the Inquirer, regarding the constitutionality of state police, in particular in the middle of the state, working with ICE, questionable constitutional issues there. So really amazing experience also for today. Dale's appeared in the New Yorker, the New York Times Magazine, Time, and other publications. So long intro of the two of you, but welcome to you both. And so we don't usually have two wonderful people to interview, so I'm going to speed talk as usual and ask you sequentially so we can hopefully keep that straight. And then you all get questions, and as I said, if there aren't questions, there's no beer next time. So I know you've got them out there. And you all have about half an hour at the end, so that's quite a number of questions. So let me start off, Ayo, and talk about how you got to where you are. That's in 2 paragraphs. No. But really, where you came from, and maybe a key mentor who placed you on this path, and why you're doing this immigration work.
So I was born in Nigeria, and I traveled to the United Kingdom. I get my Uniteds mixed up. When I was 4.5, because my family had already migrated to the United Kingdom during the 60s, when England was looking for people from the former colonies to come and help to do work that the British did not want to do, the typical immigrant story, right? So that's how I got to the United Kingdom, and I was educated there, and I qualified as a solicitor there. In England, you've got the differentiation between solicitors and barristers, and solicitors are the ones who work with clients, and barristers are the ones who typically go into court and argue cases. I had decided when I was about 12 or 13 that I wanted to be a lawyer, and I was saying to Elizabeth earlier on today that I was actually inspired to do this by a TV show called Rumpole of the Bailey. And if any of you have seen that show, it is so alien to who I am because he was completely pompous. But somehow I loved that, and that thought that was what I was going to do. But in my visioning of who I was going to be in my grown-up life, I simply had the idea that I wanted to help people. Didn't really know what that meant. As a 12, 13-year-old, you don't really know what that means. But that was my goal. And so I got it completely wrong, because I then went into corporate law and I was doing mergers and acquisitions. For me, I got it wrong. I mean, there are people who love that kind of work. So I realized that wasn't really the kind of work that I was interested in doing. And then I was offered the opportunity to work with a non-profit organization in Manchester, which is in the north of England. At the time, it was a very dreary place, and I hated being there because it meant that I was outside of London, where I had grown up, where there was a lot of excitement, and I was away from family and friends. It was very isolating, but I worked with a group of really committed, passionate immigration advocates. And that was really where my own passion for immigration was built. And you ask who inspired me, and I really have to talk about my first boss at the time, who was Stephen Cohen, who's no longer with us. And when I think about him, he was really sort of a socialist in a way that in England it is okay to be socialist and be on this communist spectrum.
Oh, no.
I know it's
Shocking.
a big deal here, but that was him, and he was really somebody who advocated this idea that there should be no borders, that no one was illegal, that everybody should be able to move around freely. And I loved that idea. I don't aspire to it myself because I think the older I get, the more pragmatic I get, I guess is the polite way of putting it. So Steve was really the one who built the passion in me, because he was the one who taught me to understand about immigration law and its effects on people, and just how actually being a representative and helping someone to navigate complicated legal systems, you get to do the most important work, and that is, especially if you're talking about asylum law, because you actually get to save people, which sounds a little pompous in a way, but that's really, that's what the work is about.
Wonderful, fascinating. Dale, I'd love you to answer a similar sort of question, which is, tell us about where you were from and maybe a little bit about your family, which may have inspired you to do what you're doing.
Well, I grew up in Birmingham, Alabama in the 1950s and 60s,
So I was a very young child during the era when segregation was still legal in the South, and during the whole civil rights movement. The church bombing happened, as you know, in Birmingham. So I was surrounded by that whole struggle and a lot of injustice. And I also was lucky enough to have parents who happened to see all of this as profoundly wrong. And they kind of raised me to question it. They encouraged me, even as a young child, to ask them questions about what was all around us. And they also were really role models. I mean, when I was asked in the interview with Michael Youssine who were my mentors, I actually had to answer that I think it was my parents, because I grew up in a world that everything around us was wrong, and I had parents who disagreed with it, and they were not bomb throwers or crusaders, but they really did dedicate themselves to trying to make a difference, and over the long haul, I really believe they did. My dad was a doctor. Do you want me to go into this now?
I would love to hear this story.
Okay.
It's a riveting story.
Okay. And he had been in the public health service and was very oriented toward just using the experiences of people with the healthcare system to document what was working and not working, and try to bring to public attention what needed to change. And so one of the things that he did, he was a pulmonary medicine pulmonologist in addition to being an internist, and he volunteered after he went into private practice to read the chest films that the mobile vans would take going around the city seeing if anyone had lung disease. And he started from the 1950s keeping a chart of the incidence of lung disease in Birmingham based on how far people lived from the steel mills. Birmingham was the southern headquarters of U.S. Steel, and it was enormously polluted. He kept this data for, I guess, over 15 years. And when the environmental movement suddenly took off in the very late 60s, he called a science writer for the Birmingham News and said, I have this data, would you like to see it? And he had found over time that the incidence of lung disease, there's a mountain in the middle of Birmingham, and if you lived on the steel mill side of the mountain, you had 20 times the likelihood of getting lung disease as somebody who lived on the other side of the mountain. And so the reporter wrote this big story, and it became huge news. And my dad became something of a public figure when I was a senior in high school, and was on television being interviewed about all this. And he also pointed out that Birmingham, which of course was basically run by U.S. Steel at the time, that all of our legislators, our entire delegation, had sponsored the Alabama Air Pollution Control Law, which made it cheaper for U.S. Steel to pollute the air and pay the fine than to clean up pollution. And they were predominantly Republicans. And so the state Democratic Party recruited an entire slate of people to run on the single issue of clean air, and targeting all of our lawmakers, saying they had endangered our health. And my dad made speeches all over the county for them. And they asked him to run, and he didn't want to, but he did, he was kind of like the, good housekeeping seal of approval. He was a doctor who just cared about people's health. And anyway, that slate won every seat. They ousted every single incumbent, and then they introduced and passed a new state pollution control law that was at that time the strongest in the country. And then there was a little epilogue there where George Wallace, who was the governor, impounded the funds so that the Air Pollution Control Board couldn't operate. And so when I was a freshman in college, there was a day that the particulate concentration of pollution in Birmingham was so high that it was dangerous for people with any kind of lung ailment to go outside. And so when the state didn't enforce its own law, the law required them to shut down all polluting industries in an area where the particulate matter was a danger to public health. So the EPA had just been created. It was 1971 or 72. And EPA came to Birmingham and shut down U.S. Steel. I was like, a freshman in college, and my dad was on the nightly national news being interviewed explaining this whole history. So it was very amazing to see that happen. And it was something that he did over a course of, more than 15 years, but it made a difference. And it was reporting. It was just getting the facts out to the people. So
I just think that's the coolest story. I had to make you tell it again. Is that amazing? On so many levels. I've told Dale she has to write a book about that, or at least an article, so I'm waiting for it, okay? It's just, you got to share that story. It's so incredibly inspiring. And I see why you do what you do, right? And I too, so I'm not surprised. And I hope you all out there have had some kind of experience or awakening that will drive you in these kinds of wonderful directions. Okay, turning to this topic of immigration, which really is what we want to talk about in great part today. Ayo, can you tell us, and Tony, my husband, said, why don't you ask Ayo to give us the basics of the immigration system? Yeah, in 3 paragraphs. So that's part of the question. And, and what is HIAS, briefly, and then why the work you do is so important today, and how the current administrations change from the prior administration, not to become political, but how that makes this work so much more important. The change of focus from deporting criminals to deporting anyone who is undocumented, which is quite different.
So Laura would say that was a very compound question, Elizabeth.
I know, I apologize.
But that's okay. So the basics of immigration law, where do you want to start? So, So immigration law covers the benefits granting to people who are in the United States. And these can be temporary benefits or long-term benefits. So you have in the United States, actually in the United States at any one time you have 5 categories of people. You've got US citizens, people who are permanent residents who are able to stay here for as long as they want. You have people who are here on a humanitarian basis, so those are the people who are refugees or asylees. You have people who are here on a temporary basis, so people who are here as students, temporary workers, temporary religious workers, and then you have the undocumented. So those are the 5 groups that you have here. The group that most people are aware of, and so I'll sort of give you a primer in terms of what that means in immigration law because it's too complicated to talk about everybody, are those who are here as asylees. Now, I've chosen that because, the thinking is that most people know about that group because they are often demonized, right? The notion that they're here and they're sort of abusing the system. So an asylee is somebody, well, actually it's a refugee. So the term that we use in international law is a refugee. But there's a specific definition or distinction between people who are refugees and asylees. Refugees are people who are identified as requiring protection who are outside of the United States. And asylees are people who apply for protection when they are actually in the United States. But the criteria to determine whether or not this person is going to be given protection is the same whether you're outside the United States or you're inside the United States. And this comes out of international law. So in order to be identified as a refugee, you have to demonstrate that you are going to be persecuted or you have been persecuted because of one of 5 reasons. Because of your nationality, your religion, your race, your political views, or because you're a member of a particular social group. The area that is the most litigated in the United States is a particular social group. And that is because there is no specific definition of a particular social group. And this was a deliberate process by the international framers. If you think that the UN Convention on Refugees was introduced in 1951. This was shortly after the Second World War and all of the atrocities that came out of that. And so the idea was to provide protection to people who would need it. But the framers also understood that there was no way for them to encapsulate the kinds of ways that we as human beings would harm each other. And so if you have this group, this category, particular social group, that means that the refugee law doesn't immediately become obsolete because you can continue to identify people as needing protection under the particular social group. Now, immigration is nothing but political, right? I'm going to just put it out there. So a government is going to want to define particular social group as narrowly as possible, because then that means that they have responsibility for fewer people. We as immigration advocates want it to have the broadest definition because it gives the protection to the largest number of people. So that is just one aspect of the work that we deal with in terms of asylum work. And that's actually, I'd say that that's the greatest concentration of the work that I do. And in the US, you can apply for asylum either affirmatively, which means that you actively make an application to the immigration service, or you can apply for it defensively before an immigration court, before an immigration judge. Elizabeth, you have to remind me of your other questions because I.
Well, what is HIAS, and why is the change in this, by this administration, so makes your work so much more significant? Okay, so my organization is a non-profit organization, so we represent people who are low-income, indigent, and we help them to regularize their immigration status. So the bulk of the people that we're dealing with are undocumented, either because they arrived other than a US port of entry and did not declare themselves, or because they arrived lawfully but have overstayed or violated their status in some way. So at the current moment, it's estimated that there are between 11 to 13 million people in the United States that are undocumented. That figure is probably closer to the 11 than the 13 now because of things that have been happening and people choosing to leave. But that's about what is estimated to be the numbers in terms of who's here undocumented. The way that the work that HIAS does has changed significantly in the last nearly 2 years is that, I'll take a step back. So because you have this 11 to 13 million people in the United States, there's a clear understanding that you are not going to be able to deport all of these people. It's just not going to happen. Right now we have about 750,000 people in the immigration removal process in the immigration courts. So the Obama administration made the pragmatic decision that since you're not going to deport everybody, focus on people, certain groups that are going to be the priority for removal. And those groups were people who have a criminal record or people who were recent arrivals, so they arrived before 2014. So those are and there's another category as well, but those are the people that the prior administration had made a determination would be the priorities for removal. Under this administration, everything has been upended, and essentially it's taken the view that everyone is a priority for removal. There are limited resources. So in a way, it's not pragmatic to take that view, but that's the view that the administration has taken. So with respect to my work, if you can imagine it, you now have many immigrant communities who are frightened about whether or not they are going to be able to continue to live in the United States with their families. And if you think that many people who are here, who are undocumented, actually live in mixed status families, and that means that you'll have somebody who is undocumented and somebody who may be a US citizen or a lawful permanent resident, that is a significant concern because it means that often the people who actually do have status are relying on those who don't have status. And so with what's going on right now, it's a terrifying situation for people in immigrant communities. Wonderful answer to it. As you say, a multiple choice question or a multiple question. Dale, a segue from that terrific summary. You have done some groundbreaking and shocking investigative journalism as I mentioned, on the front of the Philadelphia Inquirer, and you all must read this, and Yuri, we can send them links to these incredible articles Dale has recently done about the hunt for undocumented individuals, particularly in the middle of our state. And Dale, can you tell us really an executive summary of the fact that PA, or Pennsylvania, is actually leading the country, if you could say that, in the uneven implementation of federal policy?
Yes, well, a colleague of mine, her name is Debbie Sontag, and I decided to focus on the Philadelphia region of ICE, which includes, it's mostly Pennsylvania, but it also includes West Virginia and Delaware, because we started following the press releases that each regional office was putting out after Trump became president. And they were reporting how many people they had taken into custody who were in different categories. So those who had criminal convictions and those who did not. And this nationally, only 33% of people taken into custody by ICE did not have criminal convictions, and 66% did. So, nationally they were focusing on those that the Obama administration had prioritized. But the Philadelphia region, the numbers were absolutely flipped. In Philadelphia, 34% had had criminal convictions, and 66% had no criminal convictions. So they were the 2/3 of the people they were taking into custody had never been involved with the court system, had never broken the law. They were being arrested merely because they were undocumented. And we wanted to look at how this happened, why this happened, and what that was doing to the whole immigration system and to the lives of the people who were undocumented in this region. So we did focus on it, and we found that there were many things going on, that ICE officers were, they had hoped when they started out, they had issued an action plan where they were going to prioritize people with criminal convictions, and they were going to pick up 250 people in a particular period. And then after most of that period was gone, they hadn't found many people with criminal convictions, or they hadn't been able to find them. So they just started picking up anybody who might be undocumented. They would stop vans of mushroom farm workers who were well known to be predominantly undocumented. They would actually trail the van until it was full, until they picked up all of the workers, and then stop them so that they could get more workers at a time. And these were, they would stop the van, ask for their papers. If, none of them had citizenship evidence that they were citizens. And so they took them to the ICE office, and they were, put into the deportation system. They would go into workplaces like a poultry transport company, another industry. I mean, all of the, like Elizabeth said, the center of the state is very agricultural, and a lot of agricultural workers all around the country are undocumented. So they were targeting particular industries. And then we found that local and state police, particularly the state police, were indiscriminately stopping cars whose drivers or passengers appeared to be Latino, and asking for their papers. And they even stopped people who were citizens, whose parents were from Guatemala, say, and but they were born in this country, and asked them to prove that they were citizens, and then asked everyone in their car for papers. And by the way, this is flat out unconstitutional. Police are not allowed to do that. If you stop someone for a traffic infraction, the Supreme Court says that you may not prolong that stop beyond the time it takes to address the underlying infraction. And they have, like in criminal cases, they've thrown out evidence that cops have gotten when they searched a car for no obvious reason. So this is going on in the state of Pennsylvania. The state troopers, we found one trooper who had we found, and probably there were more, but we found 19 people who'd been put into the deportation system just because he stopped them for driving without a seatbelt or something. He would kind of come up with the infraction after he stopped them. So, and then we found, in addition to the, so we found the ICE officers behaving in unconstitutional ways. We found the state police on their own, even though there wasn't there was no state policy saying what the state police were to do when they came upon an undocumented person. So they were just on their own. Particular officers were calling ICE and developing relationships with ICE. And then we found that there was really very little system of accountability. If this happened to someone who was undocumented, and it was happening frequently, it was very hard for them to do anything about it, because nationally, and I think it's probably true in Pennsylvania too, only 1 in 10 undocumented immigrants who are facing deportation charges has a lawyer. They're on their own. And somebody on his own is not going to be able to challenge. It's a very, very technical area of the law. They're not going to be able to challenge their arrest. So they're going to just be deported. And those who do have lawyers, the lawyer's goal is mainly to get them out of jail. I mean, to get them out of the immigration detention and get them back with their families or back to work. And that's what they want. And to bring a constitutional challenge to the behavior of the immigration officers or the state police who might have turned them over is a very expensive long-term undertaking. And lawyers are so overwhelmed now with cases because of the tremendous increase in people being taken into custody. They really don't have time to do it. So actually, the reason I met Elizabeth is that one of the cases I was following, the local lawyer who was representing them, didn't have time to take the case all the way up to the Third Circuit Court of Appeals, to take it out of the immigration system and into the justice system. And she sought out pro bono legal help. And it turned out that Elizabeth's husband, Tony Vail, was one of those lawyers. Yay. So anyway, and indeed, he has gotten that case all the way to the Third Circuit, that they lost in immigration court. They lost before the Board of Immigration Appeals. And now they've filed an appeal with the Third Circuit, and the Third Circuit has accepted the case just very recently. So, it's a long, long haul, but can you imagine? I mean, like, if you didn't have a lawyer in the first place,
yeah.
none of those people would even be in this country anymore.
Wow. A quick sequel to that. Dale, can you tell your cell phone story? Because it's pretty dramatic.
Oh, right. That particular state police officer I told you about, who had the 19 people that we were able to count up who've been put into deportation proceedings because of him, calling ICE. And by the way, he holds them without a warrant. We found for up to 4 hours, waiting for an ICE officer to come pick them up and take them. And that also is unconstitutional. But anyway, I was trying to reach him, and I did get his personal cell phone number, and I called and left a message. And it was one of those phones where he doesn't say his name on his message, it just says the number. So I left a message, and when he didn't call back, I called again and said, I'm looking for this particular officer. If I have the wrong number, would you let me know? And he still didn't call back, but literally 1 hour after I made that second call, I got a call from the Director of Public Affairs for ICE in Washington. Now, this guy didn't work for ICE. He worked for the Pennsylvania State Police, but he clearly has connections with ICE. And it's obvious he's working hand in glove with them, doing unconstitutional things as a Pennsylvania state trooper to funnel people into the deportation system. And he's important enough that he was able to get the chief public affairs officer in Washington, D.C., for ICE, to call me. And she said that the Pennsylvania State Police are upset that you're calling their cell phones. I mean, this is plural. I only called his. And that they're going to charge you with harassment if you don't stop. And I think you should call off the dogs.
Wow.
And so, obviously it's not criminal harassment to make a phone call in Pennsylvania, but that's how they use their power.
Not yet, she means.
Yeah, not yet. Yeah, we're moving there. Well, I just think that story is pretty amazing too. And of course, that guy is still doing what he's doing in the middle of the state, right? Carlisle County.
He hasn't been disciplined at all.
He hasn't what?
He has not been disciplined at all.
He's still out there. So keep writing your articles. I'll keep doing your work, and we'll hopefully change that. Thank you. Very interesting. So, Ayo, you work with these individuals, and you see how the changes in the administration affected them. And we read about the number of kids being separated at the borders. Obviously, that's a huge story, and the system being overwhelmed. I mean, are you all overwhelmed? Are there people desperately needing representation who aren't getting it? And what about the stories we hear that these people are getting access to services they shouldn't have, and we should throw them out for that reason too?
So, yes to all of your questions. We are overwhelmed, but then if I think about us being overwhelmed, I think about the clients who are also overwhelmed by the system. There are so many ways that the system is basically wearing everybody down. One of the really important ways that I would like to bring to everyone's attention, because so far there hasn't been that much information around it. So in April, the Attorney General, who is responsible for all immigration judges, decided to introduce a new policy whereby he is requiring all judges to hear 700 cases in a year. And of those 700 cases, not more than 15% can be sent to appeal or overturned on appeal. So we now have a system where you have judges with many more cases than they're supposed to have. As I said, we have, in Philadelphia, our judges are listing cases out to 2021. So if you can imagine being in the criminal justice system and having somebody wait that long for determination as to whether they are guilty or not guilty, but it's okay to treat immigrants that way, right, to leave them with no definitive decision. But with these quotas that judges are now going to have to meet, the cynical me is in the framing of, well, that means that there's going to be a real issue in terms of due process protections, because judges are going to be under pressure to move cases along. We've had a decision by the Attorney General, which has essentially limited the ability for judges to use something that we call administrative closure. And that was essentially a tool that they used to manage their docket. A case that was waiting for a collateral benefit from a different agency, which would then allow someone to remain in the United States. That agency may be taking months or years to make a determination on that application. That case doesn't need to be on the judge's docket, so therefore they would administratively close it until there was a decision with the agency, and then at that point the judge could then make a final determination in terms of whether the person got to stay or go. There's now no longer the ability for judges to exercise their discretion to grant administrative closure. They've also been stripped of the ability to use continuances. They are supposed to now use continuances in very restrictive manner. And the way that they had been using continuances was to allow people to find a legal representative or to complete the preparation of a case. And so now everything is being sped up. And I can give you an example. Yesterday I was in York County, where people who are detained get to have their cases heard by an immigration judge who sits in the at York County Prison. And it was a complicated case. Somebody who'd been in the United States since she was 6 or 7 years old. She'd gotten herself into trouble. But there was some very important information that the judge needed to be able to hear in order, in my view, in order for him to make an informed decision about whether this person gets to stay or go. As I went into the courtroom, the judge said, well, you have 4 people on your witness list. How long do you think it's going to take you? Because I need to be finished with this case by 11. It was 8:45. So, I pushed back and I said, Judge, this is a very complicated case, and I think we're going to need at least an hour and a half to hear the respondent's testimony. The judge said, well, I want to be finished, well, maybe by 12 then, but I don't really know how much time I can give you. And I said, well, after her, then there are the other family members, and Judge, you really need to hear it. This is a complicated case. You would never get that in a civil case, in a criminal case. But these are the things that we have to deal with, right? So
Did you win?
I don't know if I won.
Did you win against the judge?
Yes, I did. Yes,
How
yes.
long did he give you?
Well, we were there until 12:30. Wow. But you know, these are the things that we are now dealing with in terms of the pressures, and so we're now having to. And it's complicated to advocate with the judge, right? Because a lot of the decision making in immigration law is based on discretion. If I go into court and I've annoyed the judge to begin with, right? I have to really decide whether or not I'm helping my client or I'm hindering them in terms of them getting the kind of benefit that they want. So much of this is on the individual level. And that is something that is extremely problematic. But understanding that, I know that there's a line that I have to make sure that I stand behind in order to make sure that I'm the most effective in terms of my representation of the client. And so that was really what I was trying to do. But in doing that, you know, I did have to push back, and eventually the judge did allow me to push back. But you're asking about the benefits that are available to people who are in the United States. And this is a huge area, and I'll tell you why in a bit. But I mean, this is where there is so much demonization, right? Because it's the idea that people are getting benefits that they are not entitled to. I'm not going to sit here and say that that doesn't happen, because it does, right? Does it happen in the numbers that we are being told it happens? Absolutely not. The law is clear about who is able to claim benefits and what kind of benefits they can claim. Mistakes happen. I'm just thinking about a client that I was representing earlier on in the year, and her son was entitled to CHIP benefits, and he was also entitled to food stamps. It turned out that when the benefit granting agency had made a determination about the family, somehow they had included the client. She didn't really understand it, but I was able to see that she was listed as one of the people that was getting benefits. As soon as she knew, and I told her, she said, but I didn't ask them for it. I'm thinking, my approach is always trust but verify, because this is the best way that you can protect the client. So working with community legal services, I asked them to do a little bit of research to figure out what the client's application looked like. Had she checked off something that would have suggested that she was entitled to benefits? And it turned out that she was absolutely right. She had declared herself as somebody who was not entitled to benefits. Somehow there was a mistake, and she was included in the benefits package for the family. But once that was discovered, CLS was able to sort of go back and unravel that on her behalf. But the idea that people are just willy-nilly claiming all of these benefits and getting them, it is just not true. In 1996, there was major legislation that limited the availability of benefits to the documented, completely stripped the ability for non-documented to be able to get benefits. But there's something that is also now even more insidious, because the administration has introduced proposals to change the definition of public charge. Under the immigration law, if you are considered to be a public charge, somebody who is likely to need benefits to be able to remain in the United States, the government can refuse to give you permission to even enter the country or to get a particular benefit that you're seeking. Public charge has always been defined as certain federal benefits. There are always benefits that you could still get. Emergency medical assistance, for instance, that does not take into account anyone's immigration status. Anyone who is in the United States who has an emergency, life-threatening condition is entitled to get emergency medical benefits. But it's just to stabilize you, right? So, for instance, if you need a kidney, you can get the kidney, but you can't get the medication to stop you from rejecting that kidney, right? It's that kind of warped thinking. So under the proposals, the definition of public charge will be vastly expanded. And it will mean that the government will be able to take into account facts that might suggest that someone is likely to be a public charge. And in doing that, they can look at the makeup of the family. Remember I told you that often you have these mixed status families. So if you have someone in the family who is getting benefits to which they are entitled, right, that could then be taken into account to determine whether the non-documented person or the person who's applying for benefits is likely to be determined to be someone who will claim benefits in the future, and so therefore they'll be refused immigration benefit. And so what's going to happen with that is, because families are afraid, because they don't understand what is the fine line between the consideration of being a person who is likely to be need benefits or not, they're going to just play it safe, however you want to define that, and not claim benefits that their family members are entitled to. And that's going to affect you and me, right? Because if you have kids who don't have, or who are not claiming health insurance or not getting food stamps in order to feed themselves, this is the community that we all live in. And we should feel, or we should take the view that we want everyone to be able to get the benefits that they're entitled to, because this is, for some people, it's about absolute subsistence. So.
Sobering, very sobering indeed. So my last question before your questions, and I do at the very last question, though, I always reserve that one. But my last question before you all, Dale, is for you, and it's a bit of a segue or a bit of a digression, but it's about your book, The Prize. And I want to know, out of the blue, it appears to me, you wrote a highly acclaimed best-selling, it was a New York Times bestseller book, in your spare time kind of thing. And I want to know why you wrote it. Were you surprised by your conclusions? And did it lead eventually to, I think it led eventually to your immigration work, and I'd like to know how that was.
Well, I started working on the book just about a year or two after I had started freelancing. I had left the Washington Post in 2008, and Mark Zuckerberg's gift to Newark was announced on the Oprah show in 2010. And I saw in the Newark Star Ledger, I live just 20 minutes from Newark, and I saw a story a little story saying that Mark Zuckerberg was giving $100 million to the Newark schools, and that he and Cory Booker and Chris Christie, then the governor, were going to be on Oprah the next day announcing this gift. And I thought that just sounded fascinating, and I decided I would watch Oprah. And actually, it was my first time ever watching Oprah, which I'm probably the only person who had never seen Oprah. But I was totally riveted. I just felt like, they were all saying that, they basically now had all the money in the world that they needed, and they were going to take this incredibly downtrodden city and schools that had been in decline for 50 years and turn it into, as Cory Booker said in his inimitable way, a hemisphere of hope. And so I just thought I wanted to see, could that happen? I did not have a dog in the fight. They were going to rely heavily on charter schools and, the whole agenda of the education reform movement, which was at that time, really kind of budding. It was kind of young. It wasn't, as mature as it is now. And that was in fact, the announcement on Oprah came on the same day that the movie Waiting for Superman debuted. And that was the movie of the education reform movement and the kind of clarion call for charter schools as the answer to, the failing schools in the poorest communities in the United States. So I know that was a very polarizing issue, but I really didn't have a side in it. I felt like I'd like to learn more about it. What did it mean, and who was, who offered what. So I just started following this, started doing interviews, and the more I did it, I just suddenly realized, I'd been a reporter all my life. I had always hoped one day to write a book, but I'd never found a topic that I felt would really sustain, a full book. And I just thought all of a sudden, oh my God, this is my book. I'm interested in everything that this is about. I mean, it was about race, inequality, education, urban areas. And these are issues that I'd been writing about, off and on for 35 years as a reporter. So I made a proposal and I wrote the book. And it ended up taking almost 5 years because that's how long they had proposed that they were going to spend the money over 5 years, over a period of 5 years, after which they would have turned the Newark schools into a hemisphere of hope. So I followed them for 5 years and wrote the story, not just of the schools, but of the community in the city of Newark and the political leadership of Newark and the teachers of Newark and just the kids. I spent a lot of time with the school children. That I ended up finding that a lot of the money was not spent well because in large part, they came in with a set of very fixed ideas and tried to impose a template on Newark rather than trying to understand through the perspective of that community, its particular needs, the needs of the kids, the needs of the communities, the issues that the teachers were contending with. They didn't build their plan from that perspective. They built it from the top down with a lot of ideas they had brought from other places, but not from Newark. And so anyway, that was the book. And the way that got me into immigration was that after that, I ended up just doing a lot of freelance writing about education. And one story that I did was a really in-depth piece on undocumented college students. And it was a story I did for the New York Times Magazine, and it came out very, very earlier in the Trump administration. And I was just so struck, not just by the struggles that undocumented kids had getting into and through college, but what was going on now with their families as a result of the changes that Trump was making in immigration enforcement. So that's what made me want to do a much deeper look at that. And that's how I ended up doing the 3 stories on ICE in the Philadelphia region.
Wow. Fascinating. That's wonderful. I recommend the book to anybody who hasn't seen the prize. It's riveting. Okay, now it is your turn, and you have half an hour. So I want lots of questions, great questions, particularly from the students. So Cameron has a microphone, so we're going to pass the microphone around. Okay, first question. Okay, great, in the middle.
Hi, I'm Amin. I'm a second-year exec student, and my question is for Ayodele about the children in the camps that we're seeing headlines about now. What kind of work is being done, large scale, small scale? What can we do as people in the community to make that stop? I've had the urge to go and just record it or write about it and get the word out here, but haven't committed to it. Still ruminating about it, but it's heartbreaking to watch.
Yes, it certainly is heartbreaking, and I think that unfortunately this will be something that we will look back on in history, and I hope that we will be ashamed of what has been done, what is happening to the kids. As I said before, immigration is nothing but political, and this is all about the politics. This is about using children, families, as a way of deterring people from coming to the United States. And the problem is that it's not working, right? And so rather than stopping to think about the fact that it's not working, and so therefore that suggests that there must be real problems, we just keep going, we keep going, we keep going, we keep making the same mistakes. What can we do about it? So there are a number of organizations that work at the border, and unfortunately they are overwhelmed with people who are volunteering. I know even for my own organization, just after the first travel ban came in and people were awake to what was really happening in terms of immigration, we were inundated with requests for volunteers. And it's really hard to manage. I'm going to be absolutely honest. I mean, we totally understand the passion that people have, but to manage all of that and to figure out how best to plug them into all the spaces, it's really difficult. And even to go to the border, so we were trying to take my clinical students, Professor Paoletti and I were trying to take them down to Texas to be helpful. And they couldn't even find the space for us. So I would say that that is probably not the way to go. Money is always useful. And I mean, you mentioned the fact that you're thinking about writing about this. And I would say, absolutely, right? But I would also say that you need to keep pounding on the doors of your legislators, and you need to let them know that you do not want this to happen in your name, that this is not something that America as a civilized country should be engaging in at all. Will it fall on deaf ears? Yeah, I'm pretty certain that it will. But you also have a voice in terms of how you cast your vote. November the 6th is a really important vote. And anyone who thinks that their voice doesn't count, I'm going to tell you that you're wrong. However you decide to vote, your voice counts. And you need to use it. And so if you feel so moved by what's happening in the country right now, you need to go off and you need to use that vote. Because that's really the only way that anyone is going to listen. We get into advocacy, we go and knock on the doors, we go and demonstrate outside Toomey's office on Tuesdays or whenever it is. No one's listening, no one is engaging. But if there is significant change after the election, you can bet that people will start listening.
Fabulous. And I made Io come home from England to speak to you right now because we were going to do this in a month. And I said, we got to talk about the vote. So thank you. I didn't plant that, but that's heartfelt. And please, 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 and take all your friends, drive people. Yeah, you're going to do that, right? Or no more beer. Yeah. Okay, questions or no more beer? Next question. Yes, in the back. There you go. Yeah, Cameron's running around. Or you can shout.
Hi, I'm Ellen. I'm a second-year exec student. I work at NSC.
What's the acronym?
Oh, Nationality Service Center.
Nationality
Service.
Thank you.
Yeah. Thank you.
So there are two main non-profit organizations, well, there are probably three, but two main non-profit organizations in Philadelphia. So you've got HIAS PA, you've got NSC, and also you've got Catholic Social Services.
So I was wondering, since the number of refugees the ceiling that we're letting into the country is now 30,000 down from 45, if you had any thoughts about projections for the next 2 fiscal years that we have under this administration, or if you guys don't know either, because I feel like it's hard to guess. So,
Well, I can guess we're going to get very close to zero, right? Because that's the whole objective. So if you think about in 2016, for the fiscal year 2016-2017, the numbers were 110,000, right? The administration came in, reduced those figures to 45,000. In any one year, you're never getting 45,000 people in anyway, right? Because it takes so long for them to be processed, to be vetted, to go through the system. So even though the ceiling was at 45,000, as of the end of September, which was the end of the fiscal year, just over 20,000 people actually came in. So if you're talking about refugee numbers, a ceiling of 30,000, there's going to be significantly less than that coming into the country. And if you think that the UN sort of has assessed that there are 65 million people that are displaced around the world, a number of 30,000 is a drop in the bucket. But what's my projection? I think we're going to get very close to zero.
On that happy note. Really? You mean they will propose close to zero every year? They'll go down.
It's going to, yeah.
Yeah. So vote, yeah. Okay, next question.
Hi, I'm Jordan. I'm also a second-year exec student. So my question is, I guess for both of you, it's kind of around, I vaguely remember in several years ago, Alabama had a law where they hugely increased the amount of undocumented immigrants they were arresting, and there was quite a bit of pushback, particularly from the agricultural community. So I'm just wondering, is that something that's happening in Pennsylvania? Is that like, are legislators getting pressure from sort of like the agro business? Because I imagine having your worker supply hugely depleted is not great for them.
So Dale, do you want to go first or shall I go first?
Dale, are you there?
Oh, yeah, but I couldn't hear. So she wants me to answer that?
Well, yeah, both of you. So.
We were very struck by, for example, even the very Republican dairy farmers and apple orchard, owners were distraught about this policy. And the head, I believe he's the head of the state dairy board, met with Trump along with a group of agribusiness people from across the country, all of them saying, we can't function with this ICE policy. These are essential workers and you're taking them away from us. And Trump, his answer, of course, was, well, we're not targeting your workers. And they said, yeah, you are. And nothing came of it. And they didn't do anything to fight him. And I'm sure that all the lawmakers in Pennsylvania are hearing this, but it doesn't seem that anybody takes on Trump. I mean, Democrats do, but the Republicans who could make a difference and who are the majority, they don't take him on. So I don't know that anything has come of that. But the young man who asked, what can we do? I mean, I think if you go to the town halls of people who are running for re-election and ask these questions, what are you doing about the children who are being separated from their parents? This is unacceptable. And hopefully there'll be a reporter there covering it. And you can get, your question and the lawmaker's answer in the local news. And the same with the agricultural issues. Like, this is threatening the economy of central Pennsylvania. What are you doing about it? I guess sometimes that's the only way to, it makes them feel like somebody's going to punish them for it.
Mm-hmm. And didn't you say in one of your pieces, Lancaster County is the #1 agricultural county in the country or something? I mean,
I think that it's, Lancaster County and some others are leading mushroom producers, and Pennsylvania itself is one of the top apple and dairy producing states. So they're very, economically powerful, these farmers.
These farms. You want to add to that at all?
I mean, I think that business leaders have made their view clear that immigration is good for the country. But as Dale said, no one seems to be interested. I think there are certain industries that rely on undocumented workers. I mean, let's just put it out there. They do, right? And it's unfortunate. And so my own view is that if you're talking about immigration, there has to be a larger conversation around employment rights, what the minimum wage should be, whether or not you are going to continue to rely on an undocumented workforce. So you're sort of, from my point of view, this is a much broader conversation that needs to be had. But since we're not talking about immigration reform, no one's talking about those other issues either. But that, to me, seems to be part of the conversation that needs to be had. What do we want to look like as a country in terms of employment rights?
Well, and do we want to have chickens and apples and mushrooms? You know, because you've both said these are jobs that Americans don't want to do. They're pretty nasty. Okay, next question.
One thing that just to make that point even more strongly about how Americans don't want these jobs, one of the groups of workers that ICE rounded up, in fact, this is the one I was talking about, where they came in and they rounded up only the people of color and none of the white workers. This was a poultry transport company, and these workers would go to chicken farms and round up the chickens, put them into pens, put them on trucks, and take them to, some farm where they wanted, where they were, expecting these chickens to lay eggs for them. And so it's vile work. It's, you're running around. First of all, it's physically incredibly hard to chase chickens for hours at a time. There are feces everywhere. There are feathers everywhere. It's just unbelievable, what this work takes out of you. So when ICE picked up all of these workers and took them into, the York prison, this particular poultry transport person went to a temporary firm and hired temporary workers who were citizens to come and do the work. And there were 13 of them. And they, after an hour, not one of them was still on the job. They couldn't take it. They all quit within an hour. And this dairy board leader who met with Trump actually told him that story. That was the story he told him from Pennsylvania to make the point that there is no industry there is no farming in America, certainly in Pennsylvania, without these workers. And, they said either we're going to bring our workers from another country or we're going to get our food from another country.
Well, let's hope they're a big voting bloc, those farmers, next time. Okay, great. How about in the very back?
So in the Democratic Party right now, there is a proposal amongst some candidates to abolish ICE. And talking to people that are more politics oriented, they would make the argument that if those folks pull the Democratic Party into that debate, it'll actually be mobilizing for Republicans. But what I'm curious from a policy perspective, right, is it a good policy, a bad policy? Like, wouldn't arguably somebody still have to do that sort of enforcement mechanism, even if you were to get rid of the agency that is doing it now?
And can you talk about that, or just explain the acronym, ICE acronym?
Yeah, we always talk in acronyms in immigration, I'm sorry. So ICE is Immigration Customs Enforcement. So that's the enforcement arm, the people that go and detain people, pick them up. And within that, you also have the trial attorneys who will represent the government in immigration proceedings. So the whole conversation around abolishing ICE came out of witnessing what was happening with the detention of kids and the rounding up of people, the indiscriminate rounding up of people. My own view is that you need ICE. I'm not in the camp that says abolish ICE. Should we restrict the rights of ICE? Should we actually get them to follow the Constitution and to recognize the constitutional rights of immigrants regardless? Absolutely. I think that is true. But I'm not in the camp that says that you should abolish ICE at all. I actually think that, and this is getting into the politics, and this is my own view, this has got nothing to do with my organization, I'm doing that whole political disclaimer thing.
wise?
I mean, I actually sort of personally have problems with people who are on either end of the spectrum, on the wide extremes. I think you've got to figure out how you work within the middle, because I think that's what the majority want anyway, right? And do we want a secure country? Absolutely we do, right? And we can do that without standing out on the extremes and screaming at each other. We need to figure out how we come towards the middle and to figure out what would be the best for the country. That's my own personal view.
Adele, you have anything to add?
Well, I completely agree with Ayo. I think the extreme left is not doing anything. Well, it's not doing anything positive for the debate any more than the extreme right is. It was interesting. I was just in Arizona on another assignment, not an immigration story, as it turns out, but the Democratic nominee for governor there, who's challenging the incumbent Republican. I don't know if he said he wanted to abolish ICE or not, but the governor keeps saying that he said that, and it's polling terribly. And what he says that he said he didn't say he wanted to abolish ICE. He wanted to reform ICE. He wanted to start all over again from the bottom up. But I think that it's totally impractical. It's like saying abolish the police.
Mm-hmm. And it's a group that's saying that too, so.
Oh, they do, yeah. Okay, I think we have a question down here in the front. Here comes our mic.
Hi, Jenny Jarbo, second-year student at Wharton. You've spoken a few times tonight about constitutional potential violations, due process, unlawful search and seizure. I'm curious to what extent constitutional protections apply to immigrants, and then how does that relate to how it's actually carried out in practice?
So I think the second part is the piece that's important, right? So everyone who is in the United States, I was going to say the United Kingdom again, is protected by the Constitution. But what does that actually mean? Somebody who was on my board who was a private attorney and who's now an immigration judge, when he would begin his presentations, when he was allowed to do them, when he was in private practice, he would start with the sentence, "Welcome to immigration law, a constitutional free state, right? Free zone." And so really when we talk about it in that way, we're talking about the application. There are protections, right? But as Dale has been talking about in terms of state troopers keeping people for 4 hours just because they're waiting for ICE to come and pick them up, that's a violation of constitutional rights. But how do you challenge that? So when you're talking about immigrants, the standard is much heightened. So you have to show that there was an egregious, I can't remember the language now, but basically that there was an egregious, sorry?
Unconscionable?
The language is actually egregious, and maybe Dale can help me with that, but an egregious violation, right? So the standard that you have to prove to demonstrate that your rights were violated is substantially higher than other people's standards that applies to them. We talk about due process, and yes, of course, you're supposed to have due process. But if you have an immigration judge who has the pressures of immigration quotas, and so therefore they're pushing through cases, if you have a law that says that you can be stripped of your due process rights because you are going to go through an expedited hearing because of your prior immigration record. If you have a situation where judges or ICE essentially can make determinations as to whether or not they're going to give you bond, and then, do you have the right to challenge that before an immigration judge, and that's severely restricted. All of these things are perfectly lawful, right? So we say, yes, you have the protection of the Constitution, but in the application, for some people, that protection is virtually worthless. Yeah. Under the criminal law, right, you're entitled to a lawyer. In immigration law, because you're talking about a civil law, you are entitled to a lawyer, but at your own expense. We talk about the treatment of kids. You have kids as young as 2 going into immigration court who don't have the right to representation. One of the immigration judges who's at the H headquarters was in a deposition a couple of years ago where he was basically saying it is possible to teach a 4-year-old immigration law so that he or she can represent themselves.
Wow.
He said you have to repeat it several times. And when I was doing a presentation, I was giving this information. Somebody said yes until they're 21, and I thought that's a good answer. But that's how ridiculous the system is that we have to work in. And so, yes, there are the protections, but you know, to what end?
Okay, 2 more questions from the floor, and then I get my last one. Here's one right here.
No, I don't have it. Thank you. I guess it was made clear that a lot of agricultural jobs that are taken by presumably illegal immigrants are jobs that Americans wouldn't want to take. Could you please show a similarity to other jobs, particularly in urban areas like Philadelphia and nearby counties, where we could use the same argument to at least bring some sympathy from the average American worker to bear on the immigrants, the illegal immigrant population? Thank you.
So if you don't mind, I'm going to, I'm not going to correct you, but I'm going to suggest a different language use. I try not to use the framing of illegal, and I use undocumented, just because illegal has such a pejorative, it's a pejorative term, and I prefer not to. I try to recognize the humanity in everybody. So, but I mean, yes, give an example in terms of the urban context. I mean, what about hotel workers, the housemaids, right? Domestic workers who do the cleaning of offices, of homes, of hotels, restaurants, restaurant workers. There are many examples of where the undocumented are being used in the urban setting.
By Donald Trump. Hotels.
Yeah, I try not to.
Oh, sorry, I should
Thank
bring
you.
him in here. Press everyone.
But yes, I mean, yeah, and that's the whole irony, right? I
Yeah.
mean, this is how he's run his businesses. So, yeah, there you have similar examples that's not in the agricultural setting.
Okay, last question. How about at the very back in green?
Now you want to everybody put something, let me do it.
I know. Yeah, where were you earlier? No.
Hi, I'm Madeline, and I'm a second-year full-time student. And my question is in a perfect world where we weren't kind of in the midst of an immigration crisis, what's one practical policy solution that you think is maybe being pushed to the side or you'd like to see implemented outside of kind of the current problem?
How about immigration reform, period, right?
If there's one thing within immigration reform, period, that you're particularly passionate about and you can't get to because of what's going on.
One thing? I think that there has been quite a lot of conversation around. So within asylum applications, you are required to file within 1 year of arriving in the United States. For most people, that's impractical because you have people who have been traumatized, people who are afraid to come out of the shadows, people who are afraid to deal with officials. And so often applications are filed more than 1 year after someone has arrived in the United States. There is an exception for people who have filed outside the United States, but only in 2 circumstances. You have to show that either there was a changed circumstance in the country where you are seeking asylum from, something happened more recently since you've arrived, or there are exceptional reasons why you were not able to file within that 1 year. One of the things that has been a lot of conversation around and pretty good movement, forward movement on, was just doing away with that 1 year deadline because it's limiting. That conversation is just totally gone. But then, you could also talk about the number of people who are allowed to remain in the United States as temporary workers. The business community would say that, 65,000 people is not enough to meet the demands of businesses in the United States. So is there a conversation around that? Not really at the moment. There are many things that just you could get into conversation around and you could actually get coalescence around in terms of enough people to vote for, but it's not happening. DACA, for instance, right? That's been lost as well.
So my last question, I'm determined to leave on a note of hope. And I've told you, I warned you I was going to do this. So Dale, in the category of hope, maybe you talk a little bit about precedent in, I know you talked about New York State and Washington State and what they've been doing that we could do. And then I'd love you to talk a little bit about, you mentioned earlier that you blame, I don't know if that was your word, Congress, that Congress could actually sort of undo what the administration policies are. And so again, that leads to voting. But yeah, I would love a little hope from you on that. And Dale, why don't you go first on what could be an ideal outcome of your front page articles?
Well, I would like to see certainly some kind of pressure put on the state of Pennsylvania to hold the state police to the law and the Constitution. There was, I know that the state ACLU had some meetings with the governor about the issues that were in our article, and they've been gathering a lot of information and evidence and interviews with various people who've been stopped by the state police improperly, and they've brought it to the attention of the governor. I don't know if they're going to sue or if anything is going to come of it, but that's something that the governor could change in one stroke of a pen. He could, like when there was a case of an undocumented man who was improperly held for ICE in Spokane, Washington. The ACLU there sued, and they ended up winning. And first of all, the man himself got $49,000 in damages from the city, but also the city of Spokane worked with the ACLU to completely retrain their police. They have new procedures that really explain very clearly what police can and can't do within the Constitution when they encounter someone who's undocumented. And I don't see why that couldn't happen in Pennsylvania.
Yep. Well, and we talked a little bit about how when Governor Wolf, God willing, wins, that he will address this, he has said. So, and there's the Third Circuit, so we can watch that. Ayo, hope on Congress?
Is there any?
Well, no, I mean, okay, if you were queen or king or God, what would you do if you could make Congress do something? Or,
I would wave my magic wand. So I think that I would hold their feet to the fire to pass comprehensive immigration reform. I'm not in favor of the piecemeal reform, because I think that that's what has gotten us to where we are now. I think there needs to be a comprehensive assessment of the immigration scheme that we have, and make it more streamlined, yes. I think you absolutely still need to have immigration that's family-based. It's what America was made from, and that needs to stay. And should there be a different approach to the business side? Yes, I think so. I mean, I think that there can certainly be ways to encourage people to come to the United States. But if I was all powerful, and I am not, unfortunately, that would certainly be what I would want. I would want Congress to actually work together and introduce comprehensive immigration reform.
Wonderful. Well, good. So I'm determined to leave on hope. I want to thank you both on behalf of all of us for your incredible leadership, your inspiration, your amazing public service, and may you wave for many, many years, and we're going to try and clone you. Maybe in medical school can do that. So thank you. Fabulous.